So mindfulness is often understood as non-judgmental, present-focused awareness, something like that. And yet, the Pāli term, sati, which is translated as mindfulness, literally means memory or remembrance. So the question before us today is, to what extent memory has something to do with mindfulness? Is memory implicated in mindfulness? Is memory important to mindfulness and mindfulness practice? Or is it not? As I say, mindfulness is often understood as non-judgmental, present-focused awareness, and we don't see memory mentioned anywhere in that, quick definition. So recently there's been some scholarly back and forth, scholarly controversy, if you like, over this question. A number of papers were written, on the one hand by Bryan Levman, who is a scholar of this early material, as well as Bhikkhu Anālayo on the other side, sort of debating this question, to what extent or whether memory is important to mindfulness. So in this video, what I want to do is to go through sort of the major points that they make and try to come to some tentative resolution here. And I'd also be interested in your thoughts, of course, which you're welcome to put down in the comments section below the video, as always. I'm not going to be able to get into anything like all the points that they make. There are a number of papers, which again I'll link down below in the notes if you want to read them. But I'll just try to touch on the highlights to give a flavor of what both arguments are. So the discussion began a few years ago with a paper by Bryan Levman in the Journal of the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, where Levman argued for putting remembrance back into sati, or putting remembrance back into mindfulness. And one of the things that Bryan Levman begins with is talking about the importance of this word sati in the Indian context of the time. The word sati is cognate to a Sanskrit word, smriti, which had a lot of important resonances with the religious and philosophical ideas of the day. Smriti literally meant memory or remembrance, and as he says, back in the day, there was a distinction made between texts which were to be remembered, smriti, and those which were heard, or shruti. And the distinction was that the ones that were to be remembered, or that were classified as to be remembered, were the sort of human-produced texts. The ones that had been heard were the texts that were supposedly revealed by the gods in the Vedas and so on. Now, it is also interesting, on a side light, Jaya Tilak, a great scholar who wrote a book a while back on early Buddhist epistemology, notes that actually the word shruti in this context is somewhat late, and that the earlier word was smriti, and it was used for all of these things. That is to say, smriti at one point sort of meant all of Scripture in a sense. In any event, as a Brahmin, one had to memorize and therefore remember all of these texts. They were not written down for a long, long period of time, many centuries. And so the part of the duty of the Brahmin was to memorize, to remember these ritual texts, the Vedas, the commentaries on the Vedas. And so memory, again, the Sanskrit or Old Indic term was smriti, was of great importance. And this word, again, is cognate to sati, the word that we know as mindfulness today. And this cognate nature of these two words would not have been lost on the Buddha's audience. They certainly would have been familiar with all of this. Many of them were themselves Brahmins, and so would have known that indeed sati meant memory and had a resonance with memorizing early texts. In any event, the Buddha certainly knew about this tradition and probably was himself trained in some of it. Indeed, in some of the Pāli texts, the word sati has this straightforward meaning of memory. In particular examples in the early texts, it does have that meaning. So we can't assume that sati always meant something different. So the question that Bryan Levman brings up is, why have we lost this this connotation of this term when it comes to mindfulness and mindfulness practice. Indeed, Levman argues that memory has a critical role to play in mindfulness practice. For example, when we sit down to meditate, we bring to mind, we remember the instructions of the Buddha Dharma about what we should be doing during our meditation period. And when we are being unmindful, well, that's an example of forgetting those very same instructions, either for a time or perhaps permanently. Nevertheless, Levman does not argue that sati should always be translated as memory. He says that sometimes it's perfectly fine to use the term mindfulness. It's just that Levman believes that idea of mindfulness we should understand to contain a good deal of memory within it as a sort of a connotation, a background idea. As he says, I would hazard a definition of sati as follows. Sati is that special faculty of memory, supporting and supported by wisdom and heightened mindfulness, which bears in mind the Buddha's teachings and their relevance to one's own personal spiritual quest, facilitating detachment, equanimity, and liberating insight. So now we can turn to Bhikkhu Anālayo's response here. And Bhikkhu Anālayo, who is himself, as many of us may know, a great scholar and practitioner, he does not believe that memory is central to mindfulness. He looks in particular at mindfulness of breathing, which is perhaps the paradigmatic example of a mindful practice. When we sit down to mindfulness of breathing, we're not remembering anything. We're not remembering our prior breaths. We're not remembering somebody else breathing. All we're doing is focusing, as we might say, non-judgmentally, here and now on this breath. That is the point of the practice. And when it comes to remembering the Buddha Dharma, here is what Anālayo says. Being mindful of inhalations and exhalations is something anyone can do without needing to recollect with wisdom the Buddha's teaching or bringing in the catalyst of the Buddha Dhamma. All it requires is to be told to watch the breath, which in various mindfulness-based interventions is regularly done within a clinical setting that has no explicit relationship to Buddhist doctrine. So here, what Anālayo is getting at is that many times we practice mindfulness in, let's say, a setting of what's known as mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is in a general clinical setting where particular words in Pāli and Buddhist concepts are simply not brought up. All that's discussed is the practice itself in a, we might call, generally secular kind of context. And since we can meditate in that context without an explicit idea of the Buddha Dhamma or Buddha Dharma, therefore remembering that Dharma isn't necessary. Now, there are a lot of further nuances and back and forths in their argument, but I think this gets at the crux of their disagreement. Is memory critical to mindfulness, as the word sati would suggest? That is to say, its literal meaning is memory, as Levman talks about. Or is memory simply an unimportant connotation that can be left aside, as our use of the word mindfulness would suggest, as Anālayo talks about? I think both of them have points to make, and so I want to try to tease out what I think we might be able to take out of this disagreement. So, undoubtedly, mindfulness practice is complicated and difficult to precisely define, probably impossible to precisely define, but one aspect of it is that we have an awareness that we are on a kind of a path, that we are doing something for some particular, perhaps not very well understood end. This involves an awareness of sort of what it is that we're doing. Within a Buddhist context, of course, that involves an understanding of the Buddha Dharma in a general sense, but as Anālayo points out, we don't need to do that. We don't need to have an understanding of the Buddha Dharma. We may have a simpler, sort of a thinner layer of understanding, which is more let's say, therapeutic, that we understand that we're doing this MBSR class or course, or we're doing some homework, MBSR homework, because of some therapeutic end that we want, say the lessening of stress in our lives, or some such thing. In either case, we're involving ourselves in some kind of what we might term right effort, some effort that we're putting in towards some, again, perhaps dimly understood end, some place that we want to be. Or in other words, why do we practice? We want to have some answer as to why we're sitting down and taking time at this. And that this idea of having an end in sight, again, even if we don't really understand what that end is something that we will probably keep in the back of our minds. So let's take the case of mindfulness of breathing in particular. Certainly, when we're practicing mindfulness of breathing, we'll go through periods where we're simply non-judgmentally, in the present moment, following the breath. But we're also going to go through periods where we're off daydreaming somewhere. Perhaps we're thinking about yesterday's dinner or something like that. And certainly when we are off remembering yesterday's dinner, we're not really practicing correct mindfulness. And I think Bryan Levman would 100% agree with that. However, there's going to be an instant here and there, and I think we've all perhaps experienced this, where suddenly we will remember what it is we're supposed to be doing right then. We'll think, aha, I'm supposed to be meditating right now, and it's probably best not for me, therefore, to spend time thinking about yesterday's dinner. So there are two different sorts of memory that are involved here. The first sort is the unskillful, at least in this particular instance, unskillful example of daydreaming about yesterday's dinner. And the other example of memory is the skillful, at least again in this instance, example of remembering that we're supposed to be meditating, remembering what it is that our right effort is directed towards, which is meditation, perhaps getting farther along in the Buddhist path, or perhaps making our life less stressful. And so we have these two different sorts of memory here, and we certainly should not confuse them. So our tendency to daydream, or to get caught up in one or another of the 5 classic hindrances to meditation, is in part, I would say, an example of forgetting what it is that we're supposed to be doing right there. We forget, and so as a result, we end up somewhere a million miles away. On the other hand, coming back to our practice is itself an example of remembering what it is we're supposed to be doing. And all of this, I think, is consistent with what Bryan Levman is trying to say. That said, Anālayo's point about meditation on the breath is completely correct. That is to say, that when we are in serene meditation on the breath, as I'm sure Bhikkhu Anālayo is able to do at very, very long periods, much longer than I can, we're not going to be thinking about, we're not going to be remembering anything in particular. We're only going to be focused on that breath, that very breath right now, right here, right now. However, that said, we might contemplate the possibility that that ability to sit here, and right now is, in a sense, supported by a perhaps subconscious, that is to say, something that we're not aware of in our conscious, focused awareness on the breath, but a subconscious sort of frame of memory, of some kind of mental impetus that keeps us on the path, that keeps us oriented towards right effort in what we're doing right there, as opposed to, say, standing up and going and doing something else. So this support of keeping in mind the Dharmic instructions, I think, is an important thing not to lose sight of, even if it's not something that's directly in our conscious awareness at the time. Perhaps it's something that we might consider as coloring our conscious awareness in a certain respect, like colored glasses may somewhat tint your view of the world. It's not something you're aware of directly, but it's coming through in the actions that you're actually taking. But I'd be interested in your own thoughts on this, or perhaps your own experiences in meditation. Now, I did an earlier video on the general history of mindfulness that touches on how our ideas of mindfulness changed through time, how the main sutta on mindfulness changed through time, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much for watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below and up here on the screen, and see if you want to help support the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.